Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Louise Watt. Hungary has assumed the European Union's rotating presidency, and its Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, is leveraging that. He made unexpected visits to Russia and China, startling the EU's other 26 members. Apart from Slovakia, they all condemned Orbán's actions. Their foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, now says to send a message to Orbán, 2 important EU meetings will not be held in Hungary, adding to a boycott already announced by the European Commission that says they see Orbán's visits as an affront to the EU's political unity. To delve into this issue, today we're joined by Max Lin Tzu-li, Tunghai University Department of Political Science Associate Professor, and Brian Hugh, New Bloom magazine founding editor. A very warm welcome to you both. Right, so the trip at the centre of it all. In July, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán went to Ukraine, Russia, China, and the United States. It was clearly a busy time for him. He met everybody. He met Zelensky in Ukraine, he met Putin in Moscow, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and he even found time to meet former President Donald Trump. Now, Orbán described his mission, his trip, as a peace mission aimed at ending the Russian-Ukrainian war. But his unilateral mission has angered EU leaders. Max, how do you assess Orbán's peace mission?
Okay, that's very great question and important. And Orbán called it peace mission, but I call it mission impossible. Why? Because normally, what kind of country can become a peacemaker? Never can be like a small country like Hungary. Of course, all due respect, I respect Hungary, this country. But according to the history, never can have this small country, small-sized country with this economic power, military power, and can make it happen. Then the question is, why Russia, China, Ukraine, they all welcome to Orbán's visit? Because Orbán's visit fit for their national interest. For example, for Russia, they want to show not all the Western group always against Russia, still have Hungary. And for example, for China, they need a friend in the EU. And Hungary now is the best friend for China in the European Union. And for Ukraine, of course, they welcome Orbán's visit because they want to have a peaceful negotiation now. So you can see, and also for Trump, for his election, and he always claimed he can finish the war within 1 day. And seems Orbán can help him to reach this goal. So consider all these factors. That's why they say peace mission, but we all know it's impossible, made by Orbán.
Okay. Well, we'll delve into that a little bit more about, well, what's Hungary getting out of this? But first of all, let's just look at the EU's reaction. And Brian, Viktor Orbán ruffled quite a few EU feathers there by claiming that it's the EU that has a pro-war policy, whereas the EU would say, well, actually, it's Russia doing the warmongering in Ukraine. So do you think Orbán is stepping out of line within the European Union?
Yeah, so it's definitely likely to provoke some people that he's using this kind of rhetoric, because that's what Russia has claimed throughout, that it was Ukraine that was actually provoking Russia to attack by getting too close to NATO. And so this framing, then, one has seen this in terms of how Russia would like to position and describe what occurred, rather than this being an invasion of Ukraine that took place because of Russia. And so it could be because of negotiations that he starts off by accommodating Russia in terms of the kind of way he frames the war in Ukraine. But I think it's likely to anger particularly Western European countries. And at the end of the day, those are the countries that really do matter in terms of economic weight and political power in the European Union. And particularly, I think, for Central and Eastern European countries in which Russia is much closer, they might have different priorities because they might not be as economically large, but Russia is on their doorstep. And so they might be more induced to negotiating or prefer a more conciliatory approach to Russia.
Well, Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, is saying that Orbán's disloyalty must have consequences because as far as he sees it, it's just embarrassed the bloc. So they're not now having their next foreign minister, defense ministers meeting in Budapest like they were supposed to. It will happen in Brussels. Now, the Hungarian foreign minister's reaction to this, Peter Szijjártó, he said, what a fantastic response they've come up with. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but it feels like being in a kindergarten. So has the EU reacted childishly here, Max?
I won't say childish, but you can see they have very limited tool to, punish or sanction to Hungary. And why? Because we need to remember the European Union is an international organization. It's not a country. So the member states always upland the EU. So, and of course, they can, do a lot of things to punish Hungary. But the result is you push Hungary out of the EU. It won't be good for the EU's united. So that's kind of this language, to show the media we are angry, we dislike Orbán's behavior, but not much they can do, especially they are rotating presidency right now.
All right, well, let's look then at Hungary, because you said, Max, that it was in Russia's interest, it was in China's interest, even perhaps Ukraine's interest to welcome Orbán there. But what about Hungary's interest? I mean, what did Hungary get out of this so-called peace mission, if anything?
Easy to say, to be the best friend of Russia in the West, they get the very cheap oil and natural gas, since the EU won't import from Russia. And of course, they can sell to China, to India, and also Hungary. So that's the first one. Also, they got a very cheap loan from 1 billion euro from China and for 3 years term. So they get a lot of benefit from Russia, from China, from Global South, for example. So I think that's definitely interest. And also Orbán, since 10 years ago, they already built a personal relation with Putin and Xi Jinping. So ideology, Hungarian people, they don't care about ideology. They care about the real interest in here.
Practical, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, because of course, since the Ukraine war, the EU has banned the import of Russian oil. And Hungary was one of the countries that sought an exemption on that because it said it couldn't quickly source energy from elsewhere. But not only is it now still buying natural gas and oil from Russia, it's actually struck new deals, so it gets even more from Russia, while the rest of the EU, they're trying to do what they can to avoid it. So Brian, is Hungary's friendly stance towards Russia, is it purely, as Max suggests there, practical? Is it based on commercial interests, getting energy?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. Part of it is this infrastructure and resource dependency on Russia, but that has also pushed it into further alignment with China. The world's increasingly divided according to geopolitical blocs, and here, in this sense, Hungary is positioning itself, despite being part of the EU. I think particularly it reflects the contending forces within the EU itself. But I think also it does reflect a lack of faith in the Western-led international order, particularly regarding American power. And so that's another reason for alignment with Russia and China. But I think there's also a sense of hedging bets, not wanting to necessarily place all one's eggs in one basket. I think it's also a way to increase one's negotiating position, particularly when one does take office. One often claims that one will make deals and broker agreements that previously could not take place. And so I think this is what Orbán is trying to do. And if he can actually allow for what appears to be progress on negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, then that's another way to strengthen his own position relative to the EU and globally.
Yes, because if we look at, as Max mentioned, on the China front, so Hungary has they've got $1 billion of loans from Chinese banks for infrastructure and energy projects. And again, this is against the trend of the rest of the EU who've been trying to diversify and also reduce their economic dependence on China. So again, is it commercial interests or is it more part, Brian, like you're saying, of this bigger geopolitical competition? Why is Hungary now moving closer financially to China?
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting is that if you are the European Union country that does that, for example, you can actually secure advantages that perhaps other countries don't have if you stand out as the friend of Russia and China. And so that's also part of it. But I think it's particularly a challenge with regards to Western Europe and these major economic powers in the region. They have not always been willing to break ties either. And so it's actually interesting that this has become discursively this kind of political football.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Hungary, just this small country in the EU, well, relatively small, and it's standing up to the rest of the EU. How should we see this, Max? This small, is it David and Goliath, or how should we be looking at this?
Yeah, so that's the question I like to ask myself. We know how dare this small country can be so different with the other European alliance. I think they are very practical, as we mentioned before, and also I think ideology to say they never think Russia or China are a threat to Hungary. But the others...
They don't see them as a threat?
No, not at all. So that's not, I won't say that's not my business for Hungarian people, but they get the benefit from this conflict between the West and the East. And I think that's the fit for their national interests. And according to their ideology, they don't see they are enemy. But why the European Union or Polish, they think Russia attacked Ukraine as an enemy because they believe their ideology is very different. And they are enemy if we don't stop Russia right now, and tomorrow they will come to Poland, come to Czech. But Hungarian, they never think Russia will go to their border.
Even despite their history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And why is this? Why not?
I think that's very open personality. If you ask the 40% of Hungarian people, I don't think they got the same answer. So there are two groups, pro-EU and the pro-Orbán, I would say that.
Okay. Well, I wonder how much can Orbán change the direction of the EU? Because in recent years, the European Union has grown more skeptical of China. Mm-hmm. There's taken a tougher attitude over things like they've wanted to reduce economic dependence on China. There's been disagreements over what they see as China's record on human rights and also Taiwan. Could Hungary start a shift within the EU over attitudes towards China, do you think, Brian?
I think it depends. It's a good question. However, I don't really see major changes. I think really the major powers in the EU will stick to their existing ideologies. And I think in terms of how Hungary has positioned itself, let's say as compared to Czechia or Lithuania, it actually does reflect differing historical viewpoints on the Cold War. And that plays into how one understands the present, in which NATO is present in Europe. And then there's this contention regarding Russia. So I actually don't expect that to really change. It is possible it does create more wiggle room, though, because, as was mentioned, there are pro-Russia politicians in the countries in Europe. Even in Ukraine, for example, there was the pro-Russia political bloc, and they were in power before. And so I think it actually does help to remember that many of these countries are divided. And this figures into the domestic political debate in these countries as well, what their stance on Russia is versus or relative to the EU and NATO and Western European countries or the US behind this.
Yeah, so it's quite incredible, really, that with all these domestic debates going on within each country in the EU, you have the rest of the EU sort of standing on one side and Orbán on his own over there, it seems. So as well as his trip in July to various countries, we also saw in the same month the European Parliament elect Ursula von der Leyen for another 5 years as the president of the executive, the European Commission. And in a speech before she was re-elected, she said that she would seek to deter China from invading Taiwan. Some see this as her clearest stance yet on countering China and supporting Taiwan. And she also spoke about how the EU would, under her, cooperate with Japan, South Korea, New Zealand and Australia to jointly face challenges posed by China. Max, what future assistance do you think realistically the EU can give Asia and specifically Taiwan?
I have to be very honest. In military way, it's very limited because the EU, they don't have military power that belong to NATO. So in military way, what they can do is very limited. So we can imagine why you use assistance, because Taiwan is so small and China is so big. How can we defend China by our own self? Of course, we need the help from outside of the world. And consider the fact that until now, the EU, they won't sign the BIA, the trade, the investment agreement with Taiwan. And the only reason is still consider about China's reaction. So the best way to help Taiwan or Asia is we help ourselves first. We need to be confident that Taiwan is important not only to ourselves, but also to whole the world. It's not only geopolitical, but also for the chip or for the AI. So for all this, I think both sides, including Taiwan and the EU, we need to invest in each other. Consider that the EU is the biggest invest Taiwan's partner, but Taiwan, we invest the EU very limited. So I think first we need to consider ourselves. We need to increase our investment in Europe first.
Mm-hmm. Brian, what do you think if we look at what von der Leyen said? Beijing reacted strongly to her words. A Chinese foreign ministry official called it gross interference in China's affairs and said playing with fire on Taiwan is highly dangerous. So if the EU does draw closer to Taiwan, if it expresses more vocal support at least, if it's not capable of military support or even economic investment, what can Beijing do about this, do you think?
It's a good question, because I think particularly, again, Taiwan is what Beijing would like to frame as its red line. And so here, China is attempting to send a signal. But this is not new to the EU or any other country in the world either. It's reiterating many of the same messages. I think the question is, what strategies will the EU take? And I think that compared to the US, for example, under Donald Trump or a future, perhaps second Trump presidency, it might be a less flashy approach in terms of, for example, allowing for some visits or some trade agreements, but then not doing it in a way that leads to strong reactions from China, because China does react when there's symbolic means of support sometimes that may not have economic backing, but perhaps there are ways to do it more quietly and support Taiwan in that way. That itself is a debate in the US, and it's interesting to see when that occurs regarding how European countries can also show support for Taiwan. But I think that China is expected to react angrily, regardless of what occurs.
I mean, really, can it do anything else apart from react angrily? Is it all bluster? What else has it got in its toolbox at the moment?
I think a lot of it's optics, the wolf warrior diplomacy and so forth, though China sometimes does try to dial that back. It's unlikely then China would undercut economic agreements over this. Military threats, that's also not likely to happen. So it's more, I think, likely to be noise, but it depends on what tenor it takes. And I think one might see more wolf warrior diplomacy around major international events, particularly if it does put Taiwan in the spotlight.
And could this noise affect EU-China relations going forward? Because we know, of course, as China has come up against what they would view as unfriendly administrations in the US, both the last two administrations, Beijing has viewed Europe as an increasingly important player on the global stage and tried to move closer towards it and reset its relations with Europe after previous wolf warrior diplomacy got people's backs up in European capitals. So going forward with the re-election of von der Leyen, with everything that Orbán is doing, trying to get China back in the fray, is this likely to change the directions of EU-China relations at all?
As Brian already mentioned, it's not easy. And mainly not because the security issue, mainly is because the trade. And EU and China, they are each other's the big trade partner. So it's very important to each other, especially under the situation of the US-China competition. EU enjoy a very important leverage. both the U.S. and the China, they all need the EU. So now the EU, what's their choice? Actually, they don't choose anything because they need to follow American in the security concern, but also they want to, the China can, open their market to the EU more. Still, if the EU still want the economic growth, they still need Chinese market. So in this consideration, I don't think the relation will really change. No, at least before the end of the year, this year, we know who is the next American president.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's look now at the EU-US elections because, there is an election coming up, and of course, we can't avoid it at the moment. It's around everywhere. So if all goes according to forecasts at the moment, Democrat Kamala Harris will be facing Donald Trump. The EU has a history of friction with Donald Trump. Given that, how should they be preparing for either a possible second-term President Trump or a first-term President Harris?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think particularly all bets are off with Trump. And there's a possibility that Trump himself will say that he can make a deal with Putin because of his good friends, or Xi himself, because Trump can be, if anything, unpredictable and suddenly have friendly relations with historical enemies of the US. And so I think all bets are off in that case. And then particularly, I think for the EU, it's caught in between. And that could lead to tension because the EU also does not want to necessarily come off as simply having to bend whenever America says anything. And so I think there might be some friction there that occurs. And it's also possible there is then deviance on China policy between the EU and the US. There might not be this working in lockstep, particularly with the Biden administration. There's an attempt to reassure traditional allies that the US would, again, partner in a more reliable or predictable way, which would also continue under Harris. But if it's Trump again, then it's very hard to say.
So EU leaders already reeling from the fact that Viktor Orbán went to Moscow, met with Putin, went to Beijing, met with Xi, then turns up in the US meeting Donald Trump. He wrote on X, "It was an honor to visit President Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago today. We discussed ways to make peace. The good news of the day, he's going to solve it." Now, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because Hungary's motto for the rotating EU presidency is "Make Europe Great Again." So do you think, Max, that Orbán sees a political soulmate in Donald Trump? And if so, is this going to, if Donald Trump wins out again, is this going to make the EU lean closer to China again, even if Orbán wants to be close and best buddies with Trump?
That is very funny scenario we can expect if Trump wins. And suddenly, Ukraine war stopped. And then everybody become friends because Putin can be a friend with Trump, can be friend with Xi Jinping, and Orbán, can he lead the European Union? I doubt that. So imagine the reality, this scenario won't be happened. And we know Trump already in White House for 4 years and not big change to the world. So I won't worry too much. I think for the European Union, they will, united ever than before because they know each other. And Orbán, he will continue to use this, the gap between the West and the East, and get more national interest for himself and for his country.
And going back to what we spoke about right at the beginning of his peace mission, I mean, if Orbán, can forge these relations with Xi, with Putin, Brian, do you think it could have any impact at all on the trajectory of the war in Ukraine?
It's a good question. I think it fundamentally depends on Ukraine and what Ukraine is willing to accept. It's hard to know in this case, but I also think that there have been moments of tension, of course, between Ukraine and Trump, and so that may come up again. I think also the EU would actually potentially fracture. For example, someone like Macron would perhaps become more confrontational with Trump, whereas Orbán, it's hard to say. There's certain style of politics, I think, shared between him, Xi, and Putin and Trump regarding, for example, strongman politics or leaning towards the political right in a way that they might align, in spite of the fact that it goes counter to their apparent national interests. And so it's very hard to say, but I think particularly Ukraine would dig its heels in if that were the case.
And then what could we expect if there's Trump in the White House, Xi in Beijing, and then the EU? Which one would it, if it's stuck in the middle, I mean, would it feel like it could lean towards one or the other? Would it carry on in a very much a direct path? Because, you know, it has to balance these relations. Max, what would it do?
Okay, do we remember that the first term Trump won the election and he received the call from Taiwan, and China was so angry. And also we remember that Trump went to Pyongyang to meet Kim Jong-un, and what happened for next? Nothing. So we can see Trump can do something, yes, different with the formal politician, but in the reality, we know nothing really changed. And according to his team, and his team is very, against China. So I don't see Trump's personal attitude can change the world. And the people expect just 4 years. We can, waiting for another 4 years. And after 4 years, he need to, step down, and the life can be continued. So I won't see that will change a lot, because the fundamental factor is still in there. China needs to compete with the US. They won't stop.
Well, we'll be keeping an eye on this and also the rest of the EU rotating presidency and what Orbán does next. Max, Brian, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you for joining us. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.